Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to my session today about governance for Microsoft Teams. I'll start with a brief introduction. My name is Jasper Oosterveld. I'm from Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and I work as a modern workplace consultant for a company called InSpark. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, I believe like 7, 8 years or something like that. My expertise area is, no surprise, governance. In combination with compliance and Microsoft Teams. So that's what I mainly focus at. I also have a SharePoint background, and I still do that a little bit, some OneDrive. But for like the last couple of years, this has been my main focus area, so to speak. As I said this, I lived in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. It's been a while for me since I spoke at an event. I think the last time was, I think October or something. And I just recovered from COVID, so so fingers crossed, everything goes well. I'll do my best. So I'll keep this very brief because by now everybody knows what Microsoft Teams is, but it does help to set the context of the rest of the session, so to speak. Microsoft Teams, of course, the hub for collaboration and communication. Not based at, but it supports 5 pillars. Of course, the first one is chat, so it's a little bit of a different way of communicating for a lot of people out there, especially in their business life, so to speak. It does help to promote a more informal culture within a company, and it's, in my opinion, it's also a lot easier and more fun as well compared to email. Then we have meetings, basically compared to what we're doing now. This is sort of a meeting. But I think we saw this, especially the last couple of years, that Teams was used a lot around this area of expertise. You can just do meetings, share your screen. You don't have to drive everywhere anymore. So that's definitely really well done. They made a lot of improvements. With calling, I'm basically meaning the replacement of your phone center. I don't really know the English word for it, but that everybody just calls through Microsoft Teams. What traditionally was done with Skype for Business and still is being done. Then, of course, we have collaboration. Now, that's also one of the biggest ones, of course, working together in teams, channels. And the last one, of course, is apps and workflows. So you can digitalize your business processes and expose them through Microsoft Teams. So these are 5 powerful pillars. If you implement this well enough, of course, with governance and adoption, you will definitely see a lot of business value from Teams. This is one of my favorite ones, actually, is that you have a central and integrated work experience. And with that, I basically mean you work within Teams and you do a lot of your work with Teams. So you don't have to switch that much with other applications. You can check your calendar, you have OneDrive, you can collaborate on files, you can chat with your colleagues. So you can do more and more and more with Teams. And by doing so, you'll definitely increase your productivity. It's always hard to pinpoint how much, but I think when you work more within one application, your concentration level stays a lot higher. It's less distraction, and that really improves your productivity. No, this one was more from a couple years ago. There's a lot of companies who wanted to accelerate the digital transformation. So meaning they want to move more and more to the cloud. Now, of course, because of COVID, most companies had to do this. They didn't really have a choice. So that definitely accelerated that process as well. But with this, Teams is a cloud-only application. So, if you haven't done it yet and you want to accelerate the process, Teams really helps because it's a cloud-only application. And last but not least, Teams can be compliant, can be secure. From the Microsoft side of things, it definitely is, right? Your data is safe. But you as a company or whatever, education, it doesn't really matter. You as your organization, you have to implement a couple things yourself to make sure you're on your side also compliant and secure. And we'll touch upon that a little bit near the end of the session. So when I talk to customers about Microsoft Teams, I show them what it can do. Maybe they've worked with it a little bit. There's always some worries that spring to mind. And one of that is, so with worries around implementing it, of course, and rolling it out. And one of that is they're afraid of an explosion of teams. Everybody can create a team, and within a matter of days, there are hundreds or thousands of teams. That's a worry. There's also a worry about a lot of duplication of teams, especially if you go more for the self-service way, that you allow people just to create teams through the Teams application. This is very warranted because, as far as I'm still aware, there's not really a way that Teams says, hey, you're now creating a team called marketing, but there already is one with the same name. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there's still not like a message that said, hey, are you sure you don't want to use this team? Especially if teams have a strange, not a strange, but like a name that doesn't really make clear what the purpose of the team is, it can become unclear. So you can have a lot of teams that basically nobody really knows what is this team about? What is it being used for? Finding teams can be tricky, especially if they're private. It's very difficult, almost impossible to do. So it can be difficult to find certain teams you actually want to use or have to use. Complexity, that's basically around the creation process of a team. And it sounds weird because, I'm assuming, assumptions are always wrong, but I'm assuming most people in this meeting, that's the sort of meeting, but in this session have more of a technical background. But you have to remember, if somebody is not really technical, the creation process can be very vague because it talks about templates, Microsoft 365 groups, and that's not really clear for people without a background around all those topics. So that can be very complex. And last but not least, this is a very valid concern, is a data leak. Like sensitive data is being stored in teams and it's accidentally being accessed by people who shouldn't have access to it, or people are downloading it and spreading it around. Mute this one. But so let's say if you don't address this, like if you don't address these worries, this is what can happen. It can become very chaotic, right? Your team's implementation or rollout can actually fail. Hopefully not as bad as this gift, but but it's definitely, that's why this is so important to implement a governance strategy. So why is this? Why do you need one? Well, there are a couple of reasons why you should definitely focus on this. And don't worry if you already rolled out teams, you can still do this, right? It's not like, oh, I already rolled out teams. No, never mind, I can't do governance anymore. That's not the case. You can still do it. Maybe you have to do some extra work to like maybe change a couple things, but you can definitely do it, and please do so. But the first one is connecting IT and business. And these are basically two groups of people who've been traditionally separated from each other. Like a long time ago, IT basically, well, maybe you're still an organization where this is the case, but in general, IT used to be the department that basically told you what to work with. Now this radically changed, especially with the cloud, internet, personal devices. But it is still important to bring these two groups of people together so they definitely understand what's important, so they understand from each other what's important for them. What are their worries? What are their responsibilities? So if you bring these together, you can definitely make sure they communicate better and collaborate together with each other. Within governance, you're going to make a lot of decisions that also impact your adoption and change management strategy and approach. For example, you need to teach people how to work with teams. Let's say somebody has the role as owner. That means that person is able to invite external people. So if that's the decision you took in your governance strategy, that you're going to allow external collaboration, the people with role of owner need to know, okay, what are my responsibilities, right? So these two are really connected with each other. So this folks says the focus of this session is governance, but please also focus on adoption and change management. Well, I don't know the agenda out of my head from this event, but I'm very certain that there's going to be a lot of governance, a lot of adoption sessions as well. So don't miss those. You probably, as an organization, have a lot of procedures and processes that you need to match with the usage of Teams. So Teams doesn't know if you are or aren't allowed, for example, to work with third-party applications. So if that's not the case, that's something you have to disable. And next to that, you probably have to comply with certain law and regulations, right, related to your country. Maybe I live in the Netherlands, so we're part of the European Union. They have certain law and regulations. Maybe your type of industry has some as well. So you need to make sure that Teams knows how you can combine those two, because Teams doesn't do that out of itself, right? It offers the tools, but you have to implement those. Now, last but definitely not least, is you need to be able to manage the impact of Microsoft 365 groups. And to do so, I always use a couple slides that I'll go over with you as well to explain this a little bit more to our customers. And also feel free to use this slide deck, by the way, when it becomes available for your to work with your customers or internally within your organizations. You're totally free to do so. So this is actually I did a session with ShareGate, I believe last year. So I'm reusing some slides I used during that session. But a Microsoft 365 group, to explain that, is that you have what they call an Azure Active Directory that stores, on one hand, users and groups that contain users, right? And by doing so, they can work with Microsoft 365 apps and services. But there is a type of group called the Microsoft 365 group. That group provides a centralized membership. So everybody who's added into the group has access to Microsoft Teams, Planner, SharePoint, Stream, maybe a couple other ones as well. So that is what it does. So you have to imagine if you create a new team, a couple things happen. On one hand, you get a Microsoft 365 group in Azure Active Directory, and everybody within that team automatically gets access to these other services. So on one hand, you need to make sure that if teams are created, IT side of things, they understand what's happening here and how to manage it. And users, I don't like the word, but employees, they need to understand how to work with teams, but also all these other tools and services provided by Microsoft 365. So so if you turn Teams on and you let everybody create a team, it's not just a team that's being created, but a lot more. So it's important to understand that impact. So what we've done, we've created a 3-step model to implement a governance strategy. So we first start with a governance workshop where we bring in business and IT. Then we define and finalize the governance strategy. And last but not least, it also needs to be implemented. We'll dive a little bit further into these 3 topics. So the first step. So during this governance workshop, a lot of topics are being discussed, and I can go over all of them within this session because I only have 40 minutes, so that's definitely not possible. But one of these topics is vision and goals. So you need to be clear as an organization, what is your vision and what are the goals connected to the vision about using Microsoft Teams within your organization? That's something you can also take from your adoption and change management strategy, by the way. Those should be the same. Now, once you've finalized and implemented your governance strategy, there needs to be a group of people who make sure this is done properly and that the governance strategy is also being adjusted when it needs to be. So that's what we call a steering committee. You can also call the governance board. It doesn't really matter what the name is, so long you have a group of people who monitors and adjusts the governance strategy appropriately. Roles and responsibilities. It needs to be clear what roles are available or being used within Microsoft Teams. So on one hand, these are the administrator roles. So you need to know who is administrator or which department is administrator. What are the responsibilities of that role? So let's say down the line, you need somebody with a certain role, you know who it is. And that person also know, hey, I have that role and this is what I have to do. Well, this one we'll dive into a little bit further, so skip this for now. Same with this one. Then you also need to take a look at your processes and procedures. So maybe your backup and restore strategy, your employment process, your new features and updates. So those are all, and maybe some other ones you have internally. You need to write those down as well and match those with the way you're going to use Microsoft Teams. And of course, security and compliance, also very important. I'll touch upon it a little bit near the end. So let's start. So the first thing you need to do is discuss what kind of collaboration templates are we going to use with Microsoft Teams? Like, how are we going to collaborate? Now, you see a couple examples. These are the most common ones. But it can also be the case that you have different ones. But my advice is to keep it small. Don't define 10. And because it's just a lot of work, to implement that directly in the beginning. You can also do that in phases. So start with a couple. These are the most common ones I see, at least with our customers. It's very important to also understand the aspect between public and private, because you can collaborate, but you can do it in a private way or in a public way. The public way is often part of an intranet. It's not really collaboration, so to speak, but you can imagine that you have a public project site, right, where you explain to your colleagues, to the whole organization, what projects there are, what it's about and who's part of it. But that's often done with a SharePoint communication side, not really with a team. The private side, that's where the collaboration takes part, and that's of course done with Microsoft Teams. So when I talk to customers, I'm always trying to make this distinction so they know, okay, they tell me, these are our collaboration templates, and then I ask, is there also a public part of it? And there often is, mostly for departments though. So first step, collaboration templates, and everything that follows now is basically connected to those templates. So you have to think about, do I want to apply a naming convention, right? It's optional, you don't have to do it, but it has some advantages I'll discuss in the next slide. But you see an example here. So for example, you have a department is the template. HR is a department, of course, the type is private. And then, for example, you can say every time a department is created, the DEP, the abbreviation, is being added before the name of the department. And I also want to have a different URL so that for everybody who's using it and they are in the browser, they can see, hey, this is a department, it's private, and it's HR. Now, the same applies for projects, right? This is just an example. But it's very similar. But then you do PRJ, and then you see here the abbreviation as well. So what are some advantages? It's definitely easier to find those teams, especially if they're public. You can find them easier, and it's also more explanatory for people what the purpose is of a team, because you can see it in the abbreviation, in the team name itself, and also in the URL. There's basically one main challenge, and that is if you make a naming convention required, you're often bound to a provisioning solution. That's because natively it's very difficult to connect a different naming convention to different templates in Teams. So that doesn't really work well yet with what's available out of the box. It's totally fine to use provisioning, by the way. I'll talk about it later as well, but that's something you have to be aware of. Next up, how are you going to monitor inactive teams and how are you going to act upon those, right? Why is that actually important? Well, that's because there can be teams that are just inactive that have certain content that should be archived by law or regulations, or it's just sitting there just doing nothing, and it can actually should be deleted, because why would you keep inactive teams indefinitely? Yeah. This one is a little obscure because I think we all know that space isn't really an issue. But again, if you have like hundreds of inactive teams, it's just, why would you keep it there? Just because you don't want to clean it up? Like, in my eyes, that doesn't seem logical. And what you do get then is that the IT is like, okay, let's go over all the teams you have. And then it's such a long list with inactive teams, it becomes very time consuming for them to do something with it, right? To manage it. So how can you manage inactive teams? You can do this through the Microsoft Teams Administration Center, right? You can go there. I looked at the previous session, I watched a little bit. I think saw some activity reports there as well. That's something you can use so you can see what teams haven't been active for a certain amount of time, right? But there's also something called an expiration policy with Azure AD. So what is it? What this does is that you can define your expiration policy, attach a certain amount of days to it. So you say if a team hasn't been active for 90 days, just an example, it can be automatically removed, right? The nice thing is there's an activity check. So because you don't want owners of a team to receive emails like, hey, your team is going to be deleted. Do you want to keep it? While that team is being used on a daily basis. So there are some activity checks for Teams and SharePoint, and that basically revolves around has somebody opened the file or has somebody visited the channel. If that happens, it gets automatically renewed. The responsibility for renewal or removal always lies with the owners. So this is, again, why that adoption and change management strategy is also important. Because if you go this route, the owners need to be aware of it and they need to know what to do. And that's something you tell them in the adoption and change management strategy. If a team is being removed, it's been automatically moved to a recycle bin for 30 days, where only IT can restore it. After those 30 days, the team itself is deleted, The SharePoint side of things still has a 60 extra days because SharePoint has a 90 days recycle bin for site collections. You can also use external tools. I named 2 here. I'm not here to promote any tools, but these are the ones I've seen providing functionality around this topic, and I've seen what they do and how they work. That's why I added them here. If you do look into an external tool, just do an inventory for yourself, request a demo, but there are plenty of tools out there who can provide this. So what are some advantages of managing active teams? Well, you get an automatic cleaning, right? Cleaning's maybe not the perfect word, but your tenant gets cleaned up. So all your inactive teams can automatically remove. You don't have to do anything for it. So IT can also focus on other activities. There are so if they have enough to do. So if this has been taken off their list, it's freed up to do something else. What's very important is that employees need to be empowered as well, right? The Microsoft Teams is mainly for them, right, to do their job. It's also good for them to feel some sort of responsibility for it, right? So by doing that, but going this route, they get a little bit more responsibility, and I think that's really important as well. So they feel more connected to teams within their organization. That helps also with the adoption process. So what are some challenges? Well, if you really have to be careful that teams with certain data doesn't get deleted that shouldn't have been deleted. So that's why you really have to look at your retention policies connected to a certain law and regulations. Is there a certain type of data I am required to keep for a certain amount of time? Or the other way, am I required to delete it after a certain amount of time? So don't implement this inactivity check and automatic removal before you've looked at your retention policies. You're giving more empowerment to your employees, and people who have the role as owner need to be aware of this, right? So that's why they need to be aware and have to also feel some responsibility for it. You also need to have an end of life strategy that needs to be clear, right, as an organization, because often something has a beginning and an end, right? Projects, for example. So what is our strategy? When does something start and when it ends, what do we do? Do we just let it sit there? Do we do a monthly check? And do we automatically move stuff to an archive? That really needs to be clear, right? And this is something that can evolve as well, right? Maybe you don't have anything in place. That's fine. You can still define your governance strategy, and then you just say this is something we'll discuss or research after implementation. But eventually you need to come up with something. Maybe you notice I'm using a lot of sentences. I normally don't do that, but I think this is more helpful for you as a viewer to take this presentation and to also implement it yourself. Now, that's maybe, if you notice that, that's maybe that's the main reason I do it as well, to help you out as well. So then we have to take a look at external access. So there are basically 2 levels. First one is access to teams. So are we going to provide guest access to teams and to our templates, and which ones are they allowed to participate and which ones they aren't? I can imagine that departments, that's something you don't want people to invite guests, but for projects, yeah, of course, right? So that's one level. And then you also need to think about the level of type of sharing links, right? Because you have 4 type of sharing links. You have the everyone that I would never recommend, because that basically means if you get a sharing link, it can go through the whole world and everybody can have access to the documents. You have new and existing guests. So that means people can just share a document with anybody out there in the world, but it's a personal invitation. Or people need to be added to your Azure AD before they can, for somebody can share a link, or none. So you can also combine these things. So you can say, okay, guests are allowed, but I only want documents to be shared with existing guests, for example. So there's some variety you can go for as well. So that's one part. So yeah, you discuss per template, are guests allowed, and what kind of share links are allowed. Next up, you also need to kind of monitor and manage external access, because similar to inactive teams, not everybody needs to have access to your tenants indefinitely, right? So there are a couple things you can do. You can go look at Azure Access Reviews. You do need Azure AD Premium too, but that provides you where you can basically define a review process where Every quarter, for example, the owners have to review the guests within their team, and they can decide, okay, that person can stay or that person be removed from the team itself. I believe that currently it doesn't delete the external person from your Azure AD, but at least they're taken out of the team. Right? Then you can also create a custom solution. I added a link in the resources to somebody who made a solution for that, but it's basically done with Azure Logic Apps and Azure Functions, where you, for example, can send a customized email to all the owners, where they're being reminded, hey, you need to take a look at your membership around the guests in your team and remove people if they can be removed. You can also do it manually, because you can go to Azure AD as IT, and you can see, okay, these are our guests, and then you can see, okay, who hasn't been active for maybe 90 days. And then you can say, okay, our policy is if somebody hasn't been active for a month, we remove that person from our Azure AD. What are some advantages of enabling external access? Well, you definitely prevent shadow IT, because let's be honest, everybody needs to collaborate with external people. It's just the way it is. But if you're going to block it, people will find a different way, right? They will use Box or Dropbox, for example. And of course, yeah, you want to provide a modern and efficient collaboration. And that is just being able to invite guests in a certain collaboration template. But you don't want people to send emails anymore with attachments if that's not necessary. So what are some challenges of enabling external access? Well, you really need to take a look at data classification, because let's say you have a project team, which sends the data. Of course, that external person needs to have access. But once he or she has access, they can do whatever they want. They can just download the data and then share it with people who should not be allowed to see it. But if you implement data classification, you can, that person can download it, but somebody else is not able to open it, for example. It does give a lot of responsibility to owners, and that's totally fine. But they, again, need to be aware of it, and they need to be aware of the responsibilities, and they also need to know how to do it. As a company or organization, you can, of course, have external people working for you, but then they have an account for your Azure ID. Then they are not really seen as an external person, right? They're not seen as a guest, but they're seen as an internal employee. So make sure you also are aware of that, and then see how you implement it with the whole management of external people and allowing external people. Then we have to take a look at the privacy settings of our collaboration templates. Now, very easy. They're public or private. Most times I see private. Sometimes I see public, but the most one is actually use private, but it's something you have to define and write down as well. Then you can also think about, okay, I'm providing a project template. Do I want to provide additional channels and tabs per channel as when somebody creates a project template, for example? So internally within InSpark, when a customer team is created, there's automatically a private channel for only InSpark employees. So if we work together with customers in a team around a project, we can use that private channel to discuss certain stuff internally, or maybe store some concept documents. So that's an example you can do. Now, shared channels are also going to be released relatively soon. For example, you can say when a department template is being rolled out, I automatically get a shared channel, for example. Then you also need to take a look at your membership actions and settings. Sorry. It's always nice. Drink some water. Okay, so per template, you have to decide what are the members able to do, right? And I just include an example of all the options you have. But for example, you can decide that members are not allowed to add or remove apps. So that's something you can include in your template. Same with the settings. Maybe you say, okay, I don't want to use gifs or memes or stickers. You can turn it off. You can also see how you manage tags, for example. So once you've done that, once you've decided what templates you want to use and all the topics I just discussed, then it's basically time to decide, okay, how are our employees able to request a template? Does it need to be approved? Because some maybe do, some maybe don't. And how is it being created? Is it automatically created? Does somebody else have to create it? And there are basically two options. Either way, you go for self-service. So people are going to create a team through the Microsoft Teams application. And that can be all employees or maybe just a selection. Or you go more for the provisioning route, where you create your own provisioning solution. Maybe you buy licenses from a third party, but then people often go to a form, they fill it in. The form is maybe approved, maybe it isn't, depending on the template. And then the team is created based on all the properties we just discussed. In my line of work, this is the one that's basically being used all the time. And that's basically because of the requirements per template that often can be implemented by the out-of-the-box features of Teams. And Microsoft is going that route more and more and more. You have Teams templates, for example. So I definitely can see in the future that it will be possible to do that through self-service, through the Microsoft Teams application, instead of creating your own provisioning solution. But for now, this is often the way forward. There's no problem, of course, but something to be aware of. Now, next up is you also have to discuss your Microsoft Teams policies and settings. So, for example, are you going to allow private or, in the near future, shared channels? And that's something you define at the top level, right? In the Teams Admin Center. So what you define here basically is being pushed down to all the underlying teams. Are you going to use Teams templates? And if so, what is your policy going to be like? Are you going to allow all templates? And who is going to be able to use the templates, right? Update policy that resolves around the new features and updates with Microsoft Teams. You can assign that policy to a selection of people, so they will get the new features before other people do. Your app policy. So are you going to allow all Microsoft apps, right? The SharePoint, the OneNote, the Word, etc. Are you going to allow that? That's something I would recommend, because that, in my eyes, that's the foundation of collaboration in Teams. But I think we're all aware there's a huge marketplace with like so many apps, like 95% I've never heard of. Yeah, are you going to turn that on? Or are you going to allow a subset? And what I often see, and I also advise, is that you turn it off and then do an inventory, like, hey, we as an organization, what kind of third-party apps are we using? For example, Jira, for example. Is that something you're using on a daily basis? Then just allow that one and then block the rest. What are your meeting and live event policies, right? Are you going to use live events? With meetings, are guests, for example, to share their screen? There's a lot of options you can decide there. You need to go over that as well and discuss that internally or with your customer. What are your messaging policies? Are, for example, owners able to delete messages from all the members in their teams? Can guests delete their messages, for example, or can they edit it? Then there are a couple other settings. There's tagging. Are you going to allow tagging? What I always advise is to turn it on, but just make it available for owners. So not all the members will create tags, so it can become a bit messy. But a good scenario for tags actually is if you have a large team, of course. So for example, we have a team called planning, where I think almost every employee is in it. And then our planning department uses a tag per expertise. So for example, I'm in compliance expert team. So there's a tag called compliance with me and a couple other colleagues. So if there is a question or message, they'll just address it to that tag, and only we get it. We get a notification, not all the other 100 people, for example. So that's a nice scenario to use that. Are you going to allow third-party file storage? I should have had third-party, but maybe you're aware you can, for example, say people can connect their Dropbox or their G Drive within the files section of Microsoft Teams application. I never see that. It's always turned off, but it is something you have to go over as well. How are you going to allow guest access, and what kind of settings are you going to apply? Those are basically the things you have to decide as well. Well, I think I'm pretty good on schedule, actually. So the last thing, of course, is you have to implement certain security. Like, I'm not a security consultant, but the options I'm listing here are, in my eyes, definitely something that should be there. And that's, of course, multi-factor authentication. That is something that should be there for the employees, but definitely also for guests. So people have to at least do a verification that they are the ones accessing the Teams application or a certain team, right? You also need to take a look at mobile device management. So are people able to use their own device to work with teams? And if so, in what way? Are there certain limitations? And then you'll often come across a conditional access, where, for example, people with a non-managed device can access a team, but they, for example, can only use the browser to work with files, right? So they cannot download it, for example. Then you need to take a look at compliance features. So are you going to work with data classification, right? So information protection. So are you going to provide sensitivity labels that allows people to attach a label to a document? So when that label is attached, only internal people can access the file and not external people, for example. Also take a look at data loss prevention. So making sure data isn't shared intentionally, unintentionally with people who shouldn't have access, right? So this can really be connected to certain what they call sensitive information types, like a credit card number. So let's say a credit card number is being added in a chat. It can be automatically blocked, for example. And the last one is information governance. So taking a look at, okay, what are retention policies? Is there certain data that needs to be saved for a certain amount of time? So it cannot be deleted before a year, for example, or it has to be automatically deleted after a year. That's something you have to take a look at as well. Don't worry, these options, like especially the compliance options, I often do afterwards, because if I include this all in a workshop, in the first initial setup of the governance strategy, it will become a bit too big. So I always advise to pick it up afterwards. So first do the first setup of your governance strategy, and then immediately follow it up with this. The security stuff, that's often being taken care of before with a project. Maybe it's already there. Maybe it's initially being set up with your team's rollout. I often take, when I have a document for the governance strategy, I often make like a reference to certain security documents. Same for compliance, because you also want to prevent that governance strategy document doesn't become this thick, for example, because it will become a little bit unusable. So it's fine to refer to other documents. So we've done the workshop. What I often do is I often do 2 hours, because that becomes a little bit too much. And in those 2 hours, I go over all these topics I discuss with you as well, and give them some food for thought. And then after a couple of weeks later, we come back together to basically see what information has been found, has been written down, so we can try to finalize the governance strategy. So 2 to 3 weeks, that gives people some time to make decisions, think about stuff. Ideally, you get an agreement. That often works. Sometimes customers need more time. It's totally fine. Just make sure you know what topics still need to be addressed and when it's being done. So try to, let's say there needs to be more time to think about a backup strategy. So like, okay, how much time do you need? So and it needs to be a little bit of an end date. Otherwise, this is going to take too long. When you're done, try to present it. Take some bullet points, like you don't have to present the whole document, but the important stuff, present it to the group, and then see if everybody agrees, and then try to finalize it. And we often finalize it within a Word document. You can do this completely different. You can do it in a PowerPoint presentation or a SharePoint page. Doesn't really matter, as long you write it down somewhere. Write it down, as long you add it in something so it's stored. And then, of course, it's on to onwards to the final step, and that's basically the implementation, right? Because you decided on your strategy, and now it's time to implement it, right? For example, get a provisioning solution, configure your Microsoft Teams policy and settings. Because you took some decisions on certain topics, you have to make sure they're implemented as well. The first one is often relatively easy. It's very straightforward to implement those Teams policies. This one often takes a little bit longer, or you need to create your own provisioning solution that takes time. You need to acquire one, you need to test it out. So this one often takes a little bit longer. And of course, you need to start with your first meeting with the steering committee, so you get the ball rolling as well. So that was basically it. So what I've done, I've basically 2 final tips. Microsoft Teams, as we're aware of, evolves, right? There's a lot of new features being added. So definitely make sure your governance strategy evolves as well, because the decisions you take now are maybe different. The outcome can be different a year later, because your organization changes and Teams changes. There isn't really a right or wrong. So, it is your organization, it's your governance strategy, it's your team's implementation, right? So, what maybe works for certain organizations doesn't mean that it's also applicable to yours. So, don't worry about that. It's your governance strategy. I added some resources, so if you want to, you can take a look at it as well. Yeah, last but not least, if you want to get in touch, it's totally fine. I added my Twitter profile. You can always send a tweet, or you can send me a message in LinkedIn. It's also fine. And I have a blog as well. I mainly blog for for other companies, but I add referrals to those blogs as well. So yeah, I think I did pretty well. Yeah, right on time. I was actually I was a little bit worried I would need too much time, but it's yeah. So it was good times. I hope you enjoyed the session. So yeah, it would be awesome if you can rate it. And yeah, to see if there are any questions.